Levana, an imaginary character from Lucia's Graves novel, The House of Memory, will accompany us along this story, partly real and partly fiction, of the Jewish people of Gerona in Catalonia, Spain. It is also the story of a house located in the center of the Cal, name given to the Jewish quarters in that part of the Iberian Peninsula. In this place, the synagogue, a house of study, reunion and services of the Jewish community, was located, and also the site where the Spanish Kabbalists of the 13th century formulated the ancient tradition of Kabbalah. Probably the famous Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, or Nachmanides, also known as Bonastruc Saporta, lived in this house. That morning, Levana woke up earlier than usual. It was a very special day for her, because that evening she would be dining at the house of her cousin Isaac and be formally introduced to her fiancé, Vidal Ruben. This day, at the age of 16, she dreamt with all the illusions of a woman of her age. She was happy, in love, and looking forward to the fulfillment her life promises. Every day, before helping her mother with the daily domestic chores, she liked to go to the rooftop, the only place where she could enjoy the beautiful view of Gerona with its red rooftops neatly close to each other, and the waters of the rivers Oñar, Teruel, glimmering under the sun. Far away, towards the north, she could see the mountain range preceding the Pyrenees as a drawing in the horizon. Levana was the last descendant of Nachmanides, who lived in that house in the center of the Cal, as the Jewish quarters were known in Catalonia. The house was located in the high end in the fortified premises called La Forza, which means fortress. It was lined by the Sant Llorenç Street, which at that time marked the end of the Cal. In those days, all the doors and windows of the houses in their west side were blocked with stone and plaster due to a royal decree. These decrees were imposed, then later relaxed, and this situation lasted for about 100 years as a part of the history of looting and killing of Jews. It was a moment when great violence was unleashed on a Holy Friday against the Jews of Gerona, making the King of Aragon, James I, gather his people and come to their defense. Again, in 1348, the Jews living around the city gathered at the doors of the Cal looking for refuge. In 1391, the Cal was not only looted, but also burned and partially destroyed. The Jews sought refuge at the Gerona Tower, where the Castilian Simón de Llorent gave them protection. The aggression towards the Jews continued year after year from 1413 to 1418 under the rule of Fernando de Aragon. That is why the Cal of Gerona was protected by huge walls and several doors in case of attack. Levana, as all the others, was used to this confinement. That is why she loved to find refuge on her rooftop, admiring the horizon, feeling free and in union with the external world. A long time before, the Jewish communities started settling the Iberian Peninsula, probably before the Romans. The coexistence with the native settlers of the area was a peaceful one, until the conversion to Christianity of Recaredo, the Visigoth king of the 6th century. During this time, a reprimand was enacted towards all the Christian landowners, stating they should not allow Jews to bless their crops, as their tradition demanded. This is the earliest mention of their existence in Hispanic territories. From that moment on, more and more decrees of this kind were enacted to promote a definite separation between Jews and Christians. In those days, the general public did not pay much attention to the religious authorities due to the fact that Christianity was not the official religion, so the people felt free to practice and choose their own faith. There are records of a Jewish community in Barcelona around the last part of the 9th century, and the first record of their presence in Gerona is in a manuscript that states 25 families of Mosaic religion were established in the city in the year 888. By the year 1000, their presence was well known. The Jewish communities, as well as in Gerona, were mainly farmers. They settled near their monasteries and cultivated the land. In those days, they were under the protection of the kings and counts, who considered them part of their property. A new group of urban Jews began to emerge. There were artisans such as shoemakers, dressmakers, jewelers, and so on. By the 13th century, kings like James I and Peter III had them in their courts as counselors, physicians, diplomats, and financiers. The Jews cherished their communities, and the wealthiest gave big amounts of money to aid their development, turning Gerona into quite a wealthy state. They were able to lend the monarch in need of money, and were also expected to pay extremely high taxes. It is known that in 1391 they contributed 1,300 escudos in taxes to the treasury of Barcelona, demonstrating their importance in the management of the kingdom. With all this, in spite of the layman's distrust and indifference, they felt useful and protected by the authorities. Many times, these authorities were obliged by the church to issue some anti-Jew decree, but generally speaking, these were seldom enforced. The attitude of the kings toward the Jews was full of contradictions. They could not show much benevolence towards them because they were regarded as enemies of the church. But on the other hand, they filled the royal arches. Aside from living in their own quarters, it was very difficult to distinguish the Jews from the Christians or Muslims because they adopted the dress and customs of the land. The growth of this Jewry and others of the Aragon-Catalan crown was due to the protection of the king, but at an excessively high price, as mentioned earlier. Even though they were directly under the king's authority and he elected the mayor of the Jewish quarters, and since the city officials had no authority over them, they enjoyed a certain degree of independence. The Jewish Council was the judicial organism of the Spanish Jews who live in the big cities of the peninsula, as it was for the Jews in Gerona. And through this council, the Hebrew community organized their lives around their beliefs and rituals with a certain amount of freedom. The Jewish quarters of Gerona was famous for its cultural richness. Unlike the other Jewish quarters, they had their own legal and civil statutes. They had a synagogue, a hospital, public baths for their purification rituals, and the butchery where they killed the animals they used to eat according to their laws. The ovens to make bread were essential in the Jewry, and in the largest Jewish quarters there was a jail for those who violated civil or Jewish law, and a graveyard located outside the walls of the Kal as ordered by the Talmud. For Levana, as for all Hebrew Hispanics, Their community was based on family, but its influence went beyond father, mother, and children. Jews tend to maintain very close ties with their kind as a permanent need of solidarity due to the constant persecutions suffered by them. The male elders had all the prerogatives in all social affairs, starting from legal to economical to religious, up to their social mobility. The women were downgraded to household chores and to the care of children. Boys were taught to read and write because in their future they would have to take charge of the social and religious obligations of the community. And it was very uncommon for girls to learn to read and write, since it was considered useless, because they were not allowed to participate in the internal organization. A man's life was centered in his profession and his religious obligations, and they were very important to him. These two aspects filled his daily affairs. Up to what point of devotion did the Jewish community follow their religious mandates? It is an interesting observation. It appears that the majority engage in their religious obligations to fit in, be accepted, and have an identity in the community, and not because of religious conviction or devotion. Nevertheless, aside from everyday life in the Cal, around the 12th and 13th centuries, very interesting things were happening at a different level of consciousness. When the famous Rabbi Maimonides, who lived in Córdoba, died, the Jewry of Gerona became the Hebrew center where the Jewish mysticism of the Kabbalah flourished. The most important legacy of the Jews of Gerona was their culture, and due to such an intense theological activity, it soon became one of the most important religious cities of its time. Jewish mysticism was striving to go beyond the ancient law of the scholars, and with Kabbalah, the Jews of Gerona studied to penetrate the mystery of the divine. In the first half of the 13th century, a small group of Jews from Gerona, which on those days had a population of roughly 300 people, founded the first Kabbalistic school of the peninsula, which in time increased its reputation throughout the Judaic diaspora. The ancient tradition of Kabbalah has its origin in the East. When the rabbinic academies of this region began to lose ground, many scholars traveled west along the merchant routes to Europe and joined groups of empathetic people with a tradition in search of higher knowledge. During the Middle Ages, a special line of study directed by the Colimides family reached Italy and Germany, and a mixture of Eastern mysticism with devotional Jewish practices was created. Meanwhile, during the 12th century, another line entered the Iberian Peninsula through Provence, with a highly cultural level and spirituality. Many of these schools had to adapt their basic teachings to confront a renewed search of philosophy, which on those days was a big preoccupation among the intellectual elite. Groups gathered around different rabbis, exchanged letters, exchanged representatives, and visited each other. The word Kabbalah is heard for the first time in the work of Ibn Gabirol, a great poet and philosopher who lived in Malaga in the 11th century, and Kabbalah, as a line of study, begins to take form in Languedoc, Provence, a region in the south of France, between the 12th and 13th century. From there, it spreads to Catalonia, Aragon, and Castile, where it reaches plenitude. The first Kabbalistic groups are found around the cities of Lunel, Narbonne, Posquier, Toulouse, Marseille, and Arles. In the Iberian Peninsula, they especially developed in Gerona, Burgos, and Toledo, although they also spread to other cities. During the 12th century and beginning of the 13th century, Provence had the most important cultural and religious activity, and also the most heretic religious conflicts. During that time, the religion of the Cathars or Albigenses had overrun the Catholics in Toulouse, Albi, and Arcachon. This new religion pretended to return to primitive Christianity, opposing some of the basic dogmas of Catholicism. It bonded with certain political movements and acquired powerful interests in such a way that the Inquisition leashed the cruelest crusade against their followers, slaughtering and exterminating their movement from its roots. This historical moment and the anti-Catholic inclination of the Cathars specifically influenced Judaism in Provence. The focus of attention was not in the Jews, so they were less persecuted. Thus they enjoy a certain amount of freedom to develop new cultural aspects. On the origins of Kabbalah in Provence, we have to refer to the third generation of the Catalan disciples who sustained that an apparition of the prophet Elijah marked the beginning of the mysticism of Revelation. The texts of the disciples of Solomon ibn Adret, who taught in his own school in Barcelona between 1270 and 1310, acknowledged that tradition. Ibn Adret was disciple of Moshe ben Nachman, or also known as Bonastruc Saporta, and he kept a close relationship with the rabbis of Provence. According to these testimonies, Elijah's revelations were given to the wisest men in Provence: Abraham ben Isaac, Abraham ben David, Jacob ha-Nazir, and Isaac the blind. What we can confirm is that surrounding these wise men, especially Isaac the blind, the first study groups of Kabbalah began. The relationship within the groups of Provence and Spain was very intense, making it difficult to establish who influenced who. It would be more appropriate to say that these ideas were emerging simultaneously in both places, developing little by little the form of a Kabbalistic tradition. Crossing the Pyrenees, the Spanish Kabbalists would attend the academies of Provence to study. This way, a very important bond grew. Among the renowned Jews of Provence Kabbalah initiators was Abraham ben Isaac, a very famous Talmudist and president of the Rabbinic Council of Narbonne of the mid-12th century. His grandson, Isaac the Blind, who followed the tradition, used to mention him, as well as his father Abraham ben David, as teachers of the hidden knowledge who do not speak of those matters to any non-initiate in the secret doctrine of the mystical sciences. It is important to mention that in this historical moment, Yehuda ibn Tibon of Granada lived in Lunel, patron city of the translators, whom disseminated the Arabic Jewish Neo-Platonism originated in Spain. The school of translators in Provence and the Iberian kingdoms were very important in the translation and transmission of texts coming from the Far East, knowledge translated from Arab to Hebrew to Romance or Latin. Moses ibn Ezra, a philosopher of the 12th century and great traveler of his time, also translated texts of Neoplatonism for the Provence circles and introduced the mysticism of Ibn Gabirol. All these greatly influenced the formulation of the Kabbalah between Spain and Provence, being this relationship quite fruitful on both sides. It must be remembered that during the Middle Ages, ascetic ideals could emerge at any moment among Islam, Christianity, or Judaism. We should be aware that similar ideals emerged in Provence due to the decadence of the Catholic clergy, which provoked the glorification of these ideals incarnated by the perfectic Cathars. I would like to talk a bit more about Isaac the Blind, a legendary figure, a Kabbalist very much liked and one of the major influences of his time, though later forgotten. Isaac the Blind lived around 1165 to 1225 in Posquier, where he had a rabbinical academy. He invented the definition of Ein Sof, referring to the absolute, and coined several new terms that helped formulate Kabbalah. People from afar and different places came to learn the Torah with him, finding refuge in his home where he taught them. He was also a very wealthy man and would cover the living expenses of those students who came to him without enough money. A Kabbalist par excellence, his conserved manuscripts refer to his theories, all of which are about esoteric themes. The epithet blind could be a clue in reference to the blind who illuminates others, or the one who does not see with human eyes, or one who can see the other's aura and know if they will live or die. Among his attributes, people thought the Bahir was one of his books, but we know now that it was written by an unknown author in an earlier time. About his teachings, he gave detailed instructions on how to meditate during prayer. He was the most important Kabbalist of Provence and was strongly influenced by Neo-Platonism. Why did such an intense connection between Provence and Gerona exist? The 8 feudal realms of the Catalan-Aragon Confederation were French territories, and they paid taxes to the French kings. In May 1258, the Corbeil Treaty between Louis IX of France and James I of Aragon modified this radically. In this treaty, the French king Louis IX passed over to James I of Aragon the sovereignty of the Spanish realm south of the Pyrenees, and James I handed over the counties north of the Pyrenees to Margaret of Provence, wife of Louis IX. This explains the tight relationship between Gerona and Provence. Maybe, after this treaty, Kabbalists began to concentrate more in Gerona. By the middle of the 13th century, the circle of Kabbalists in Gerona was at its peak. It was a center par excellence of intensive literary work, contrary to those who believed Kabbalah should remain secret. The doctrine of Kabbalah started to spread all around, taking the most diverse directions. The Kabbalists of the Gerona Center are renowned in the history of Spanish Hebrew Kabbalah due to their clear and vigorous contributions. The majority of the members of the center were directly or indirectly students of Isaac the Blind. Later, they were named the Masters of Kabbalah. That is why Gerona became the center of meditative Kabbalah before the elaboration of the Zohar. Among the most renowned Kabbalists of Gerona was the philosopher Ezra Ben Menahem, better known as Azriel of Gerona, 1116-1238. He was the teacher of the most important figure of Kabbalah in Gerona, the Rabbi Nachmanides. Azriel was also the most important student of mysticism with Isaac the Blind. His writings include the mystical interpretation of Jewish liturgy and philosophical ideas of Ibn Gabirol, both of which he integrated in the definition of the 10 Sephirot. In a very careful and organized manner, he reproduced what he learned about the Hellenic code of questions and answers concerning the origin and nature of existence. He published several works and lectures through the Iberian Peninsula on the new formulation. To this important philosopher we owe our most sincere gratitude, because he combined revelation from mystical Judaism and reason from Greek Neo-Platonism, both very polemic topics of the time. This work method formulated the metaphysical principles of Kabbalah. Azriel longed to control the tendency of moving away from the Jewish roots of educated people, by presenting the esoteric teachings in an academic form. The union of reason with revelation offered by the Kabbalah satisfied a profound need that soon flourished and became an important religious movement, disseminating throughout the peninsula with its philosophical symbolism and motivating several rabbis to write about it. Another great Kabbalist of the school of Gerona was Ezra Ben Solomon, who collaborated with Azrael. Some sources say that he was Azrael's son-in-law, others his brother. Still others say that they were the same person. But certain documents recently found established that they were two authors with very different and definite styles. It is interesting to acknowledge the belief that the geometry of the diagram of the Tree of Life was formalized and made public by the School of the Soul in Gerona, thanks to Azrael and Ezra. The Tree of Life is for us Kabbalists an essential tool by which we try to understand the attributes of divinity, the nature of the universe, and the destiny of mankind. And it is also a map that allows us to know and understand ourselves better. The most popular and relevant figure of Gerona was Moshe Nachman, better known by his Catalan name, Bonastruc Saporta. He was born in 1194. He was a wise and pious man and well known as a physician, poet, and philosopher, and of course, a great Kabbalist. He was an admirer of Maimonides, even though he differed from his philosophical tendencies. With Nachmanides, the Kabbalist school of Gerona began. He was the foremost representative of the spiritual and mystical trend in opposition to the intellectualism of Neo-Platonism, because he considered revelation to be superior to philosophy. He was an authority on the Talmud and enjoyed the respect of his peers of his time. His influence as a Kabbalist extended among all the study groups of the Torah. He was very active in politics and represented the Jewish community of Catalonia. During the famous dispute between France and the Iberian realms about the orthodoxy of Maimonides' texts in 1263 in Barcelona, everybody was anxiously waiting for his opinion. James I, King of Aragon, who frequently followed Nachman's advice in matters of justice, chose him to confront this religious controversy against Pablo Cristiani, a converted Jew from Provence. It is stated that Nachmanides delivered a brilliant defense of Judaism. It was so moving that it originated many protests in the Christian world, and this led to his exile by the Pope to Acre, in Palestine, where he lived his last years. Truth or legend, we will never know. He died in 1270, at the age of 76. It is said that his remains lie in Haifa. Unfortunately, this era of splendor was coming to an end. The hatred towards the Jews manifested by the public was increasing and led to a decline of Hispanic Judaism. The church, nobility, and municipal officials made it a common cause to pressure the king at court to react against the Jews. Starting the 14th and 15th centuries, all the Spanish kingdoms forbade Jews to wear certain types of clothes and were ordered to wear a distinctive mark so as to differ from the Gentiles, or wear a closed cape with a yellow and red sign sewed in a visible place. They could not touch food in the market or be in certain public places, as they were not allowed to enter Christian homes. These regulations were implemented probably to avoid public disorder generated by the real motive, an anti-Semitic sentiment in the minds and hearts of the Gentiles. In a way, they continue having certain privileges because they are still considered property of the crown, and much of the growth of the country was in their hands. Even as converts, they held offices as advisors, counselors and physicians of the king, but remained Jewish in their hearts. It was the beginning of 1492, and barely a year before, the Holy Inquisition had concluded a 10-month visit to Gerona, making many converts and terrorizing people with all kinds of horrible things brewing. Levana was not concerned with these ordeals. She was young and in love. It was very difficult for her to believe in the power of evil, although she felt great pain seeing the sadness in the eyes of her loved ones. This atmosphere of segregation and persecution began to be detected in Christian society, and this led to the expulsion of the Jews in 1492. It came as a result of an ambience of hostilities which began in 1480 with the decree of a radical separation of quarters between Christians and Jews, quite a different spirit from that which prevailed in the Middle Ages. The initial welcome to the Jewish people in Christian realms, needy of settlers, turned into mistrust and intolerance with a hostile pressure from the Church. These factors, combined with an impoverishment of the population, led to loss of power and privilege of the Jewish communities and favored their expulsion and confiscation of their properties. It was a political decision which definitely expelled them from the Iberian realms. After many centuries of living in the peninsula, they had to face the painful abandonment of their loved ones and possessions. With their hearts broken, they felt the land of the Sepharad, cradle of Jewish Western civilization. On March 31st, 1492, the Catholic kings signed an expulsion edict giving the Jews a maximum of 4 months to abandon the peninsula, leaving behind their belongings, their memories, and their ancestral roots. Levana, after hearing the edict, could not believe, just as everybody else, that it would be imposed in her realm. But Fernando of Aragon insisted that the Castilian Inquisition also be imposed in Catalonia without taking heed of the protest of the Generalitat, who reminded him of the enormous amount of money the Jewish people had contributed to the reconquering of Granada. Many Gerona Jews preferred to abandon their lands instead of their religion, as it was very difficult for them to change their beliefs and way of life. The rabbis were determined to maintain the faith of the small number of families that still remained in the Cal, but the community was very much weakened by the reduction of its members, conversions, emigrations, and deaths. Another negative consequence of the edict was the end of all professional activity of the Jews. They only attended their daily chores in the Cal. Men started to wander the streets of the Cal with a mixture of confusion and weariness in their eyes. Money lost its real value because they were forbidden to leave the Sepharad with their gold, silver coins, or their jewelry and valuable items. Levana's dreams were destroyed when she heard that her boyfriend, to save his family and his belongings, converted to Christianity. After that, she never saw him again. Being the last descendant of the Rabbi Nachmanides family, she was instructed from childhood in her faith. Her grandfather Ishmael taught her how to read and write, and slowly unveiled, in a very simple way, the mysteries of Kabbalah. Together, they read the texts of the Talmud, the Torah, poems of Ibn Gabirol, and the religious commentaries of her ancestor, Nachmanides. Her grandfather would tell her, "The books will remain with us and with the dark stones of the Cal, because even the stones have memory." He also used to tell her, "One mind is enough to preserve all the treasures of the past as long as it is not oppressed. Don't forget, Levana, keep your mind open and receptive. Do not close it. Even though at that moment she could not fully understand this knowledge, she could sense that it had to be preserved and saved for future generations. The rabbis of Besalú and Gerona, taking advantage of the last months before parting, decided to prepare Levana. She had already absorbed the teaching and could read Hebrew, Catalan, and a little Aramaic, so she could preserve in her memory the Kabbalistic content of the most important book of the community, a precious treasure of wisdom. They could not risk taking this book with them because it could easily be confiscated and burned. Nobody could imagine that such a young woman, almost a child, could be the carrier of this invaluable treasure of knowledge that had taken form there. All these events led Levana to understand the importance of the teaching, and she made her final decision. She would never abandon her convictions, and there would be no way anybody could persuade her of the opposite. It was a very hard decision for a young girl, but she knew she could not betray all those who had suffered persecution, death, loss of their homes and possessions to their religious beliefs. As the call was closing down, people started asking, "Where can we go? Where can we start a new life? Is it safe to take a boat to Africa or Italy? Is it true there are pirates on the way?" They had so many questions. With all this happening, Levana saw how her illusions and dreams were being taken. All of a sudden, she became a prisoner in her own call. She was frightened by the idea of exile and felt suffocated and humiliated by all these discriminatory mandates. The doors of the call were closed by night, and they were not allowed to go out in market days because the authorities wanted to avoid, as much as possible, any contact between the converts and non-converts. That was the way the whole Inquisition used to clean the church of its impurities. The shadow of the Inquisition appeared to be everywhere. If a convert would just signal to another convert, he immediately would be punished, accused of returning to his faith. The enmity was growing in such a way that guards were placed at the call day and night to avoid confrontation. The little money left after paying taxes was used to buy food that could be taken with them, but it soon became scarce. Some merchants came to the doors of the call to sell goods to the Jews, but at exorbitant prices, and the Jews would have to exchange jewelry or their most precious treasures for it. They were fearful of the trip, choosing what they could take with them and hiding inside the hems of their clothes jewels and precious stones. They would ask themselves, what will happen to our lands, our houses, and our dead buried here? How can we leave all these, abandon our settlements of so many centuries? Can they realize that we belong to Catalonia? Can't they understand that this is our home where our beloved ancestors are buried? Levana swore she would not allow anybody to oppress her mind. The knowledge she received was already part of her being, and she would never allow the light of the Sephirat to be extinguished. The day before her departure, in the final moment of closing the door of her home, birthplace of the groups of Kabbalists that gave form to Kabbalah, she remembered a poem by Ibn Gabirol. At dawn, I exclaim, "Awaken, soul of mine, and search for the face of my King and beloved." I long to remember him, and I am filled with such a burning desire that, like the partridge, I will call him from my exile. She slipped the key in her pocket. hoping someday to return. "500 years had to pass before Kabbalah returned to Spain and to Gerona. In 1993, the Kabbalah Society organized a pilgrimage with the objective of bringing back the classical Kabbalah to its place of origin, Gerona. During the invitation process, some of us had that feeling too, of returning to our place of origin. The first day of visiting the house, during the invocation, many of us had vivid memories of previous lives in the Cal. We also were told of strange and interesting incidents that took place during the early restoration period of the house. We were told that when they started to restore one of the rooms in the basement, where the bread ovens of the community used to be, the place was full of dust, but, to their surprise, they saw 3 loaves of bread, intact. But they lasted only a few seconds before turning into dust too. This may be true or not, but it was a very symbolic significance, delivering meaning to these surroundings. We were also told that during the restoration, a big hole opened up in the courtyard and a bright light emerged from it, so a Star of David was drawn in the floor in the middle of it. In 1981 or 82, during the remodeling of the house, one of our colleagues from the School of Halevi visited the site. He had an intuition that on the place of the house was the synagogue. At the time, there was much controversy as to its location, but now it is confirmed to be a fact. He decided to visit the site the next day, bringing with him his talit, his tefillin to recite the Kaddish, a special prayer for the dead. He told me that when he started praying, just for a second, he saw a bright light and could perceive the past, present, and future, and simultaneously being shaken by powerful, invisible forces. It took him great effort to withdraw from the site, and later in his hotel, to calm down his astonishment. When I was preparing this presentation, I called Ezra Ben Solomon Halevi, my Kabbalah teacher who lives in London, and asked him if he had any type of experiences when visiting Gerona. He told me that the first time he visited the house, he sat where the synagogue was supposed to be located, and an apparition passed in front of him. It was a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a medieval style. He looked very stern, like an intellectual, and was carrying 3 manuscripts. He stopped for a moment, looked at Halevi, and with a gesture manifested his approval of his work. Halevi knew he was Azrael. He also told me that in a previous life he surely visited, but not lived in Gerona, because the city seemed very familiar to him. He said that maybe many people would take these visions as fruit of his imagination. But it is true, because everything was so real. The Jewish communities in the Iberian Peninsula are considered to be by far the most important and numerous in all of Europe. Today, the Jewish quarters of Gerona, the Cal, is one of the most important in Spain. It is not only the best preserved of the Jewish quarters, but the most interesting because it preserves its medieval atmosphere and aura. The Bonastrucsa Porta Center, or also known as the Museum of Jewish History, is a very emblematic site which lies at the heart of the Cal of Gerona. The building lies over the location of the last synagogue of the city, sold by the Jewish community to the abbot of the Catholic Cathedral in 1492. From then, up to the 21st century, it had passed through many different owners. It was in 1987 when the municipal government of Gerona acquired it and initiated its restoration. In 1992, the Municipal Cal of Gerona patronage was created with the municipality, the Council of Gerona, and the Generalitat of Catalunya, and they took charge of the recovery of the cultural and physical legacy of the Jewish people of Gerona.